Hello, everybody. This is Reality Strip. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I am your host, Ben Fama Jr., and we are broadcasting live at facebook.com/Ben Fama Jr. You can leave us all your comments, all your questions, and your concerns that you want to have today. But let me talk about a film. Y'all know that on this platform, first off, I'm a filmmaker myself. I absolutely love great documentaries. And if there is a film that you absolutely need to see this year, and I posted this before. You guys know on my Facebook, I've been going crazy about this film. I'm super fortunate to have the director with me today. It's this film today that you absolutely not only must see, but you must tell your friends about. No bullshit. So the film is called Active Measures, and it's literally one of the best films that really puts together the whole Trump and Russia and mobsters and money laundering. I mean, there's so much smoke going around. There's all these little bits and pieces of the story going around, and this is basically putting it all together. One of the best films I've seen that actually puts this together. So I'm gonna show you guys the trailer real quick, and then I'm gonna bring the director in. So this is the trailer for Active Measures. Check it out. All right, so please help me welcome to the show, Jack Bryan. Jack, buddy, thank you so much for being here today. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So your film, outstanding film. I just said before I got you on the show, I literally seen this film 4 times since it's come out because it's actually that good. I absolutely love it. One of the challenges of being a filmmaker is being able to tell stories, but sometimes really super complex stories. Take me back to pre-production. First off, what made you decide to tackle such an important subject? And then what was the challenge of being able to put all these pieces together?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it really started on March 31st of 2017 was the day that I really decided to make this film. And what had happened is I had been obsessed with the election generally in 2016, and I had an election buddy who had some friends that were hearing things from the Clinton campaign, were sort of close with that world. And so I had a little bit of a little sort of eyeglass in, or peephole in. But really, I just had this election buddy. We would text and email every day being like, they should be doing this, or why are they saying that? And around June of the election year, she, after the first dump of hacks, she texted me and just said, this seems like a very Russian operation. This seems consistent with what they're doing elsewhere. And so I said, well, all right, we'll see. And then we were looking for it. We were looking at it, rather. And at every turn, what you would expect to happen if it was a Russian operation happened. And so when he won and, the story kind of felt like it was dissipating, kind of went away a little bit, we kept watching the news. And then March 31st, this day, Clinton Watts was being interviewed in front of Congress. And he was asked, why were the active measures during 2016 so successful? And he said they were successful because the commander-in-chief was repeating their talking points. They were repeating their lines. And so I said immediately, oh, that's interesting. Because now if anybody wanted to go to anybody in Washington, any congressman, any senator, and conduct an interview, they had a way in, which was to say, well, in congressional testimony, former FBI agent Clinton Watts said X, what do you think of that? And that would be a way to be able to get in and start an interview and break through that shell where nobody wanted to talk about Russia at the time because it seemed too out there, too far-fetched. And I started thinking, well, that'd be a great opportunity. In addition to that, it really needs to be somebody that knows a lot about the subject matter because there is so much research that if you were starting today, you wouldn't be able to do it in time, to do it before the midterms when people actually can respond to this. And I thought, well, also, it can't be a really major documentary filmmaker because they're going to need to wait until the public record and the investigations have kind of rolled out before they can raise the money that would be necessary to make this film. And you'd really want to have somebody that was kind of able to self-start and do it themselves, and somebody who knows how to edit a documentary, and somebody who has some political contacts that could actually get those interviews. And very quickly I realized, well, listen, if I'm not the person who does this, because I check all those boxes, nobody else is going to do it. And at that point I had read enough and known enough that you could make, and I thought at that point I was like, listen, if worse comes to worse and I can't get anybody to do an interview, I can't get anybody to, give me money for this, I will just cut together a found footage movie from what's already been reported and have a place where you could have an hour-long thing or 2-hour-long thing. Somebody could sit down, not knowing anything about the Russia story, and come away at least knowing a top line of all of the threads in it. And so that was my goal, and I knew I would do it regardless of what happened. It was just, what form would that take?
Well, you definitely have some very key players in the film, which is really great. How did you end up getting them on board? And what made you decide to pick these characters?
Well, I would say that the two sort of the biggest sort of gets, if you will, and were also the most natural choices. Hillary Clinton and John McCain, who we interviewed for the film, were both very directly affected and bothered and by the 2016 Russian operation. But also beyond that, they've been involved in pushes for democracy, especially in Eastern Europe, but throughout Europe. They have pushed back against Putin's sort of running roughshod over his neighbors. And so they were early voices in terms of exposing active measures throughout Europe. And so they were natural fits. In terms of getting them, I think that there's a really good lesson that I learned from my other producer who worked in Washington, who's never made a documentary film before. But in terms of getting people who are higher profile for documentary films, she had an amazing approach. And I think that if I'm ever making the doc again, it's what I'm going to do, which is you figure out who you want to talk to. And then you figure out, well, who are the people that are very smart and knowledgeable that they look up to? So, for example, we spoke to one of the people we spoke to in the film, who's not a household name, but a really smart guy, is this guy, Richard Fontaine. He runs a think tank now, but for years he was writing policy for John McCain. And so when John McCain was looking at, okay, who are the people you've spoken to already, and he saw Richard Fontaine on the list, he's like, okay, well, I know these guys aren't just jokers. I know they're actually talking to serious people. They're actually trying to uncover what happened. And the people that they're talking to are actually the guys that know. Whereas if we had just approached journalists first and had them on the list, they would have been much less, I think, likely to talk to us. But also it's finding people who are appropriate. You know what I mean? I don't think John McCain would have done this interview if it were just this is an interview about, or a documentary about Donald Trump and his campaign. Right. I think he would have been like, well, that's something I'm not really comfortable with. And in fact, he didn't really take any shots at Trump for the first 40 minutes of the interview. First 40 minutes of the interview were all just talking about Eastern Europe, Russia, Putin. And it wasn't until I think he really felt comfortable that really was what this documentary was about, until he started really giving us his concerns about the Trump administration, Donald Trump.
You know, that is one of the concerns, being a filmmaker myself, that trying to establish that trust with people to let them know, you're not just trying to do a hit piece. This wasn't just you're trying to take somebody down. I think you're actually trying to get the truth out there, especially right now, which is extremely, extremely difficult, and getting people on board. Did you have any resistance getting anybody to be on the film? Did you have any people that were kind of like, I don't know if this is something I really want to do?
Oh, sure. I mean, we invited every Republican in the Senate to be interviewed for the film. Only one
so you
said
did
yes.
Try. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. But I think that, and then there were a couple other ones. We were in communication with Chris Steele, and he didn't want to do it, but he seemed to give the okay to one of his friends to sit for an interview. And then for a while, we were talking to Mike Flynn, and his people were down, and then his lawyer apparently found out and lost his shit.
Gotcha.
I was like, no, absolutely not. And so, but yeah, I mean, we definitely would have loved to talk to more Republicans. We wanted to make as bipartisan a documentary as possible. And frankly, I mean, full fairness, I mean, Republicans, I'm a Democrat, but I think Republicans have probably been better on the issue of Ukraine and sort of the states around Russia, and historically, not in the last 2 years, certainly, unfortunately. But that is an issue that historically, if you're a Ukrainian and you want to have a liberal Western system in your country, you probably historically have felt more support from Republicans and Democrats. And that is no longer the case.
You brought up a good point there, especially with the bipartisanship, because people tend to think that this is just a Democratic coup, a witch hunt. And people don't, I think people don't understand that this is much bigger than a Republican or Democrat problem. That's the one thing that you did an amazing job in this film, is showing this is much bigger than even the United States. This is happening in a lot of other Western countries and stuff. So take me back to active measures. First off, for most people that don't really know what an active measure is, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so it's a Soviet term, and now Russian term, for actions of political warfare. So as opposed to invading a country with a military, which is a very expensive prospect, and it makes you look bad on the world stage, if you can affect activities through surreptitious, through intelligence means, through agents on the ground, through hacking, then that is an actually cheaper and more efficient and, in fact, more effective way at exerting control over world events.
Okay, and so how does that play into what is going on with Russia right now? Obviously, one of the things that I really like that you brought up in the film, and I even read this in Malcolm Glantz's book, A Plot to Destroy Democracy, is that Russia doesn't have the means militarily to go in and to affect countries, and so cyber warfare is the technique for actually doing that. How did you decide that you're going to play that out in the film, and what did you need to do to discover that plot?
Yeah, I mean, well, all of these things, it was really stages of discovery. And so I think that one of the interesting things for me is, in making the film especially, is to note and to see how far back these things went. So I think even as I jumped into the film, I think I made the assumption that most Americans made, which is that these are operations that started in 2015 and 2016. And in order to really understand the context of it, it's important to realize that these are operations that actually have gone back over a decade. And then in 2015 and 16, they were directed towards the American elections. So, for example, in the like the influence campaigns, they've spent $200 million since, I believe, 2007 on just their troll operations. Now, they were seeding networks, and the way that they do it is that they get somebody, they create a fake account, and that person then will follow you on Twitter or Facebook, like a lot of the things that you like, and for a year, just be kind of mirroring your activity. They put out the kind of stuff that you want to see, and then after a couple of years, when you have now liked that account stuff, you now trust that account, then they start injecting Russian propaganda. And so sorry, I've got a cat running around here. So the slow roll of it, I think, and the patience that these operations take, I think was incredibly striking to us. And that it's not the kind of thing that you can just turn it on and turn it off. It's a very slow build. And they were doing it in other countries for a long time. I mean, they had a lot of practice. And so it is an increasingly American problem. But as you pointed out, it is certainly not uniquely an American problem. And it wasn't an American problem first.
I definitely want to get into that because I want to show similarities, because I think a lot of Americans think that this is, a uniquely American thing. But I definitely want to point out how there's similarities because you bring them up in the film. First, I want to know if we can go back even a little bit to the history of maybe Trump and Russia, maybe briefly talking about it. Because one of the things that you bring up in the film is how Russian oligarchs would make investments for money laundering. First off, I know we hear the word money laundering all the time, but maybe for some people who may not understand, what is money laundering, and what's the importance of Russian putting money into real estate here in America?
Such a great point. And I think that this is probably the most important to understanding of the 2016 operations, and most important operation that was then directed. So if you are Vladimir Putin or one of like 100 guys in his inner circle, you don't really make much money legally. Your salary is that of a politician or a bureaucrat. And so the way that you make money is you steal. You steal gas money, you steal whatever public resources. So public funds that are supposed to go towards this get diverted into your pocket. Now, because that's stealing, and because it has to be stealing, because if it weren't, then money just wouldn't mean anything. There has to be a rule of law to steal from in order for that money to be meaningful. And so they have to do it against the law, quote unquote. And the way that they do that is they then take that money, they funnel it through the mafia. And the mafia is basically the Russian government's means of taking dirty money from Russia and bringing it into other judiciaries. So they want to bring it into England. They want to bring it into Spain. They want to bring it into the south of France. They want to bring it into Miami. They want to bring it into New York. And the reasons that they want to leave Russia, first of all, is if you're an oligarch, your money is safer not in Russia. Because if your money is in England, Putin can't just take it from you. Also, the ruble is incredibly unstable. And if your money is in rubles, it could be worth nothing tomorrow. Also, if your money is in rubles, it's very likely being sanctioned. And so the value of having it in rubles is less than having it in the pounds or dollars or euros. And so there's a huge incentive for them to get that money out of the country once. And also it's harder if there were investigations into where that stolen money is going, like for Sochi, for example, for the Olympic buildings, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars went stolen from those projects. They then go into other sort of intermediary banks. The mafia takes that, they pass it through, and the way that they get into another country is they have these agents, and they call them nodes, money laundering sort of investigating. They're called nodes. And what it is you get one guy who will you've got 30 oligarchs who want to put their money into New York to get it out of Russia. And so you have one guy who will do all 30 of those deals, and he is the only pass-through. The reason real estate is especially appetizing, if you will, to them, is that one, there is a cutout in the Patriot Act. So it's very hard for the government to look at real estate transactions. Two, because so many real estate transactions in America happen through a mortgage, through a bank loan, that really any monitoring of real estate transactions is about monitoring the loan. And so if you don't get a loan, the US government isn't even really looking at that transaction. And because none of these guys are looking for a mortgage, they're all operating in cash, there's amazing lack of transparency in those interactions. Also, it's very easy for an LLC to purchase a unit in a condominium. That is not the case for most investments in America. So you can do it completely without the government finding out about it. It's also, there's no limit on it. So let's say I had $10 million of stolen money that I took from some Russian pension fund, and I moved it to a bank account that I have in the Cayman Islands or in Cyprus. And the way I'm going to bring that into America is I buy one condo worth $2 million, okay? And then I set up a separate LLC to then purchase that condo from the first LLC. And then that first LLC buys that condo back from the second LLC. And then I create another LLC to buy that condo again. I just laundered $10 million from a $2 million apartment. And so real estate, because of its ability to move around in ownership so quickly, and the lack of transparency makes it a perfect vehicle for money laundering, especially if you have somebody who's very famous, who no one's going to question a lot of money and who's famously litigious as your cover or front.
What's the importance of the using the mob? I see a lot of documentaries about Russia and money laundering, and they kind of talk a little bit about it, but you kind of went into it. So what's the advantage of the Kremlin and the mob, and then what's the connection there?
Yeah, so if you're going to be moving dirty money around, you need to have somebody that can do that, right? And so what the mob does is they are the actors in that. They're the ones actually conducting the movement. And we particularly look at one mobster in general, this man, Semyon Mogilevich, who has at least been apparently allied with Putin since at least 1994, 5 years before Putin was president. And he is known as the Brainy Don. He has an economics degree. Basically, his first big thing that got him on the America's radar was a scheme known as YBM Magnets, in which he created a fake magnet company and got it on the Canadian Stock Exchange as a means of just laundering massive amounts of money. He's Ukrainian-born. He's a very powerful guy. His lawyer is actually the former head of the FBI, William Sessions. And he lives openly in Russia. He's completely protected by the government there. His biggest source of income isn't just laundering money into the United States, but is also the Ukraine-Russian gas trade. They pull hundreds of millions of dollars out of that. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, gas trade in the world. Almost all of Europe's energy leaves Russia and through by way of Ukraine. Like it goes through Ukraine and into Europe. And so it's a huge port for energy. And he and his agents, specifically in Ukraine, a man named Dmitry Firtash, who is Paul Manafort's old employer, are all under. Firtash is facing charges in Vienna for doing such, while Mogilevich is free. And they seem to be the organization that leveraged Donald Trump in 2004. I can go into, yes, a little bit about sort of Trump's background. I kind of sidestepped it, I guess. But so when we look at Trump and the Russian mafia, what we see is that it, like most long-term relationships, it wasn't born overnight. It was a long, slow process that got tighter and tighter as time went on. It's very hard to find the first instant of Trump associating with Russian mob elements. There's you see little blips very early on. Trump Village, which is a Fred Trump building, was in Brighton Beach and was filled with Russian mobsters. For the Commodore, Donald Trump's first big project, he bought something like 100 TVs off this sort of low-level Russian, tech seller who ends up becoming a billionaire through very shady means years later. But they're nothing that you wouldn't necessarily see from a real estate developer. There's nothing definitive. And then he starts working with Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn, if you don't know who it was McCarthy's right-hand man in the McCarthy hearings. Really a mob lawyer, notoriously bad guy. And Roy Cohn is working with the Genovese crime family. He is representing them, defending them a lot. And he starts, it seems, also representing the Russian mafia. And around this time, Trump Tower, under the guidance of Roy Cohn, becomes only the second building in New York to allow shell companies to purchase units. And as we talked about, the Russian mafia loves real estate as a means of laundering money. And so almost immediately, the Russian mob starts doing this. And Trump, in 1984, I believe a year after the building opens, meets with David Bogadin, who's a top-level Russian mobster connected to Mogilevich, and personally sells him 5 condos. And
I got a quick question. I got a quick question on that too.
Yeah.
When he started actually giving these condos and stuff to the Russians, did he know that these were mob figures? Was he aware of the transactions? Like, what's his awareness of that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that there's different ones for different ones. I think Bogadin, one of the reasons we really point to that one is that Bogadin was clearly a Russian mobster. He had no legal means of having that money. There was no pretense that he had any legal means of getting that money. The state attorney general called it out as money laundering. Trump met with him personally. It was a handshake deal. They were both in the room. And also, Trump is somebody who is known for knowing what is going on in his organization. I think because people assume because he doesn't know anything about business or foreign policy, or he doesn't know anything about policy or foreign policy or governments or history, that he doesn't know anything about his business. He doesn't know anything about his organization. But he does. He knows everybody that works for him. He knows what everything that is going on in every building he is obsessed with. And I think it's the only thing he knows a lot about. So I think that, I think that in that case he knew. I think that there's other cases where he might not have known specifically who was there, but there is a pattern of behavior, especially in these, well, not just in these, throughout. I mean, even in these early years, there's a pattern of behavior of Russian mobsters seeking out the Trump organization, staying in the Trump Towers, a lot of hanging out at the Trump casinos, staying at those Trump casinos. And so there is a lot of overlap. I think you could make a case that up until the 90s, in the 80s, when you have people like Yaroslav Ivankov living in his places, that you can't overtly prove knowledge there. And that period is not wildly outside the bounds of what you would see with most real estate developers in New York. Maybe slightly, but not completely. I think that a good case for him could be made then. I think less so when 2004 hits and the Russian mafia is working within the Trump organization. I think you really can't make the case that he doesn't know that. I think that there's no way around it. But in those early years, it's possible that he doesn't know the full extent of it.
Well, then you have obviously the collapse of the Trump casinos. Obviously, this guy goes into bankruptcy. Maybe we could and definitely check out the film when we're talking about this, because you really do an amazing job going in depth with all of this stuff. I mean, literally, it's super detailed, and I really love it. Briefly, for the audience that may not have seen the film, Trump goes bankrupt with the casinos. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then why he decided that would lead to him reaching out to Russia.
Yeah, so basically what happens in the 80s is Trump is a big success. He has, 3 or 4 buildings that are big successes. He purchases a lot of unused land in Manhattan. And while he is very over leveraged, sees that he's on top. And so he decides to go massive in Atlantic City. He acquires 2 casinos and builds a third. The third, the Trump Taj Mahal, has twice the amount of floor space of any casino that's ever been put in Atlantic City. And nobody is saying that casinos in Atlantic City needed more floor space at the time. So he is wildly over leveraged, goes completely belly up, has personal bankruptcies, has financial bankruptcies. Everybody that put money with him is basically screwed in the deal. Everybody he hired is basically screwed in the deal. And it's not just one. It is a series from the early 90s up through 2004. And by the end of it, there is not a lot left. Nobody's going to lend him money. He cannot do anything. His brand has been tarnished. But it still has some international appeal, but it's not enough to get money. And so at that time, the Russian mob, through a front group, a real estate organization, starts making deals and offers to Trump. And that is how he starts getting seed capital for his projects again. They start working directly for Donald Trump and the Trump organization. And that becomes his main flow of capital over the next 10 years.
So then let's walk back over to Putin real quick, because I want to kind of put these together, and then I want to talk a little bit about the whole propaganda thing. So when Putin is interested in getting into a democracy and making the fall of democracy in his propaganda, I'm going to tie this back into Trump later, but what are some of the methods that he uses? What are some of the tactics they use to get into a democracy? And when they're looking for people to help them in these kind of these strategies, what kind of person are they looking for to help them to create this kind of design?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of sort of answers to that question. I guess I'll deal with the second part of it first. That's all right. The type of person that they look for. So intelligence officers around the world, they're looking for, however, a person's ability to be leveraged. How can we take advantage of this person? There's a sort of easy acronym that's generally used by intelligence officers called it's called MICE, and it stands for money, ideology, coercion or compromat, and ego. And those are the 4 sort of levers that you can use on somebody. Obviously, money is if that person's in debt or just loves money. That was, if you look at like Robert Hansen, who was the FBI agent who turned and became a Russian asset. He was seen to be doing it for money, also ego. Then you have ideology. Someone like Kim Philby, the British spy who was at the top of MI6, who turned out to be a Russian agent the entire time. He was ideologically a communist. He had been a communist since he was a child, a young teenager rather, and carried that ideology until he defected to Moscow in the 1960s. And gave every CIA operation over to the Russians from 1940s through the 60s. And they knew everything. But that was because he was ideologically tied. Then you have people who there's compromise against them. I think that the one that people frequently point to as very likely having fallen into this camp is Hungarian President Viktor Orban, who was a very anti-Putin, pro-democracy character. Then after a meeting with Putin seems to have turned. The worst kept secret in Europe is that Mogilevich has a video of Orban taking cash payments. And that was the leverage that was used against him. Since then, they have allowed Russia into that country to basically take over their energy markets. And that's, by the way, beyond just using state actors. I think that one of the really interesting things that we haven't really talked about, and the people aren't really talking about, is how Russia uses energy leverage over countries to assert control. I think that's something we have to be concerned about as they attempt to make purchases of Exxon subsidiaries, as they are pushing Gazprom in America, that through the energy markets, they exert massive control over countries. But in terms of just individuals, they're always looking for compromise people. They're always looking for people that they can get into their camps. and they're always looking for people who, even if they're blackmailing them, even if they are, holding something over them, they want the person to feel like they're part of it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think anybody ever says, like, if you do this, we're going to expose this information. It's always as a friend. It's always like, we're not going to expose this information because we're friends,
Okay, so all right, so going back to the other question again, real quick, when they try to go into a democracy and try to turn it back over, can you give me some examples of what they actually try to do to put someone in a position of power that they want into power? Because, I mean, the one thing you brought up that was really good in the film, and I want people to kind of get the connection when they watch the film, is, again, the problem with Americans is we live in a bubble. We think everything is just happening here. But obviously there's tactics that are happening in other countries.
Oh, sure, sorry.
And they're putting these certain types of people into power that maybe even the people don't even want. Can you talk a little bit about their tactics and what they do there?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most common things that they like to do is they like to, so the Georgia campaign, I think, would be a good example of this, which we show in the film, which is they found a guy who was a billionaire who had no political background at all, no political record to really be able to be criticized on. While he was completely financially dependent on Russia, he was the largest shareholder in Russian Gazprom. And so they knew they had financial leverage over him, but he was so immensely wealthy that everybody thought, well, nobody could own this guy. And so he started running for president. One of the things that they would do is they would put out on social media, and as much as social media in the Eastern Europe is pamphleting. And they would put out pamphlets that the current president of Georgia, that he was a criminal, that he wasn't born in that country, that he was trying to rig the election. And then the candidate would start saying those things because nobody else was repeating these. It was just what they would be seeing in their social media feeds and in the pamphlets. And then the candidate saying it, because of that, the candidate sounded like he was the only person telling the truth, because he was saying what nobody else would say, but they had been hearing separately. And so it created this sort of sense of, okay, well, we are getting the real truth now. And they softened the language on Russia. One of the things that the person I'm talking about in Georgia, this gentleman named Ivanishvili, what he would say is, yeah, sure, Russia invaded us, in 2008, 4 years before the election, but and so we're not friends with them, but wouldn't it be nice if we could get along with them? Wouldn't it be better to get along with Russia than not getting along with Russia? Which, is not actually a policy. Like, yes, everyone's for getting along with people, but that doesn't mean anything in terms of negotiating a structure. That's like saying, I'm here to negotiate my raise. Wouldn't it be good if we could get along? Yes, but that actually doesn't have to do with anything with negotiating your raise. And so they would put out these talking points that didn't make a whole lot of sense, but because it was this all aboard sort of approach, it was very effective. And so I think that technique was then transposed into Ukraine. Paul Manafort was in charge of running the pro-Russian party in Ukraine. He was basically Russia's means for ascertaining control over the country of Ukraine, which is the largest country in Europe. And after doing that, the Ukrainians were, long story short, were not very happy. And so they revolted against the person that Manafort put in there, and he was forced to leave. And I think that one of the points of that, and and also, for example, in Georgia right now, Russia has immense economic control over it. And I say those two things to point out that when these campaigns happen, in the long term, as they happened here, in the long term, it's bad for people. They don't like it. And they end up finding that they frequently have to get together, organize, and fight back in ways that they never thought they would have to. And I think it's an important thing for us to remember.
I think that's one of the things that really concerns me, and you bring it up really good in the film, is that I feel like all these things happening now with the like with the lock her up campaign, and I don't know how much the birth certificate thing had to play in it, but it feels like the tactics that they use in these other countries to discredit people, especially when you were talking about the lady that got locked up in the other country.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it sounds like here. When do we ever have a politics where people are talking about locking people up? This is probably one of the first times ever in American history we heard people so rampant about it. Do you find a lot of connections there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the lock her up chants were started in a Paul Manafort campaign in Ukraine, and they in fact did lock her up.
Yeah.
They put her in jail for years. And the reason, by the way, for putting her in jail, and this is interesting, is that she signed a gas deal because Russia basically turned off all gas in Ukraine. People died as a result of middle of winter. They had no heating oil. It was a devastation to the country. And she negotiated, as a prime minister of that country, a truce to get gas turned back on so people would not keep dying. And once once Paul Manafort runs a campaign and gets a Putin puppet in there, they attack Yulia Tymoshenko for that deal and put her in jail, fine her hundreds of millions of dollars. I think the sentence was 8-10 years in jail. And she served several of those. I have very little doubt that is exactly what Trump will do here. He has certainly said as much, that is the goal. And I think that it would be if he's able to do it, it would be a very effective distraction.
That's the other thing that concerns me, is that the strategies he uses, and maybe you can go into this too. I didn't mean to cut you off, but also when it came to the media, like him always attacking the media, I feel like that's a propaganda arm of what Russia wants to try to do. Why is that important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's a very good point. It's important to point out that Putin started doing extra measures on his own people before he did them on us, before he did it in Europe. So if you want to see what Putin is going to do to his neighbors and eventually to us, a good thing is to see what he does to his own people. And one of the first things that Putin did when he got into power was to clamp down on the news media, to put it under his control. Several members of the news media who had been critical of him, critical of his campaign in Chechnya, which makes our campaign in Iraq look like child's play. And a campaign in Iraq I was against and don't think was a good idea. All the same, it pales in comparison to its atrocities, to what Putin did in Chechnya. And when reporters would write about what he was doing, they would frequently wind up dead, and there would be absolutely no investigation into how they died. And the rapidity and the consistency of that happening, it is very hard to imagine that is being conducted by anybody else than Vladimir Putin. And so the attacks on the media are certainly right out of the autocrat's playbook. If you can discredit the people who are going to attack you for the crappy and illegal or just disgusting or just anything that you're going to do, you can discredit those people with at least your base, then that gives you more power. And it allows, autocrats love having an enemy. I mean, Russia loves having us as an enemy. That's one of the reasons why, no matter what, they will never fully publicly embrace Trump. They can't, because they need to keep their own people in check. And such a huge part of that is telling them that they're under threat from America, and that we're trying to mess with their stuff. And they use that to their advantage every day. And they will never give that up.
Yeah, one of the interesting things too that you bring up in the film, which this is what leads to it too, is how they use this machine with like trolls and people making up fake news. One of the things I really love that you did in the film is you talked about how they, not only in America but in other countries, they'll infiltrate like racist groups and the far right and stuff like. Can you talk a little bit about that strategy and why that's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a strategy of trying to turn Americans against themselves or Europeans against themselves. And it is a self-perpetuating and very well thought out approach, which is they will work their way into an organization. And as opposed to trying to what they'll do is they'll try to push that organization to its extreme. So they give money to the NRA. The purpose of that, though, is to push the NRA to make it a more extreme right-wing organization. But they play both sides. They would set up the best example of them playing both sides is they set up a Black Lives Matter rally And then separately, they set up a like a white pride rally of some kind and scheduled them to take place in the same corner, at the same time, hoping to create violence, hoping to create some kind of conflict. And so what they do is they get into any organization, right wing, left wing, anywhere, and they push it to its extreme. They try to make it so that that organization, as opposed to actually speaking for the people they're trying to represent, will simply antagonize the people they're talking to. And they're very good at that. And they've done that in several organizations. And they take and I think that there are very few organizations that they actually start. I think if you want to find groups that originated through Russian money, the best ones are the Alaska Back to Russia groups, California separation groups, things like that. But beyond that, whether it's Standing Rock or Black Lives Matter, or more so right-wing groups like NRA or any sort of white supremacist group, you're going to see them as an element. They're not necessarily the founders, obviously. They're not necessarily the main people pushing it, but they're in that network and attempting to push those to their more extremes.
You know, I started a film a couple years ago, which is out now. It's called Reasons to Believe. It's where you question people and why they actually believe what they believe. You know, I challenge like religion, spirituality, conspiracy theories. I noticed many years ago as a skeptic that there's a problem with information and people not being able to question it. I never thought that we would be leading to a point where we'd have a conspiracy theory type president or people like Alex Jones and stuff. So it feels like to me right now, Russia has come in and taken advantage of our ability. And I think you even talk about this in the film, how Americans will not do research. They will not check their facts. And we all see this on Facebook all the time. We see people posting things that are just absolutely not true. What are some tactics that we can use to kind of to better understand this overall picture? And here's what I mean. One of the biggest challenges is that when you give people the truth, it's very hard for them to accept the truth as fact. And I think what we're trying to do is, fight for actual truth. But I tend to find the more we give people facts, the more they're actually resistant to it. They'll just believe, well, that's just propaganda from the Democrats or the Republicans or whatever else. And the challenge is in a situation like this, when we're trying to show Russian meddling, we're trying to show Russian interference, the connections between Trump and Russia. What are the biggest challenges we have of getting people to understand the truth and that this is bigger than a bipartisan issue?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that's obviously the big question, right? But I think that what we do is we have to be careful about our expectations. Because for me, for example, people ask, well, are Trump supporters going to listen to this film? Or are Trump supporters going to watch this film? And the answer is probably not. And so I have to think, okay, well then what in a real world, how can I make a difference here? And the way that I see my job is to speak to people that are available, that are in the middle, that are interested, but don't necessarily have a firm opinion or a huge basis of knowledge, but are interested. And if I can talk to that person and I can say, listen, this actually is serious. This is a thing that you should take seriously. This is a thing that has a long history, is well documented, and will have negative ramifications for you and your family if nothing is done about it. If we can do that, then we can move what the center is. And if you can move where the center is, it has ripple effects to the outside. And no big Trump supporter wants to hear it from me. I'm not the best agent to speak to that guy because they sees me and he goes, oh, well, that guy just made a documentary where he interviewed Hillary Clinton and John McCain. But if I can affect the middle and have a ripple effect down, then maybe I can affect the person that guy will listen to. And so that's really how I see it, is that I don't really interact with the far right trolls. They're not interested in having a conversation. When somebody says, oh, uranium one, writes in the trailer, what am I going to say to that guy? Why don't you just look at Snopes? Why don't you actually read an article on what you're talking about? Because you wouldn't, right. You know what I mean? Like, so I am not the person to talk to that guy. The guy's sane neighbor who still talks to him is the guy that I want to talk to.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the other thing is too, and I think the reason why this is also important is I know that we're not going to change a lot of people's minds. I'm sure you could give people facts till they're blue in the face, but the problem is,
I think you can change people's minds, but people that are open.
Sure.
And I think that so long as we try to be having a sensible conversation to those, then those people can carry the message.
Right. And knowing when that conversation is, because you're right. I mean, the one thing I've talked about many times is, I mean, don't be afraid to engage into a debate, even with someone that disagrees with you. But I feel like we're at this part now too with some people that it's beyond rationality. It's beyond, like, I don't believe Alex Jones is going to change his mind anytime soon in this country. And even though I'm trying to look for the rational people to have this discussion with, one of the things that concerns me is the ones that I can't, and then go and actually create harm in society. You know, one of the things you bring up in the film is the whole Pizzagate thing. Like, this information age that we're having is actually causing real world problems that we have to deal with, and getting people to not change their minds is a very dangerous thing too. Like how much patience do we actually have to wait for other people, you know what I mean, to get to the facts when people's lives are being affected? I mean, look at Alex Jones with the Sandy Hook and those people being, you know, harassed. This misinformation campaign is causing real world problems.
I agree, but I think that the thing that gets people to burn out is having unrealistic expectations. So I think everything that you said is a thing that I think we should do. But if we put like convincing and Alex Jones supporters as the goal, we're going to fail. You know, and we're going to get frustrated. And, you know, I feel like all disappointment comes from unrealistic expectation. And I think that if we really set out practical goals of like, just the people who are open, just the people who are available. But listen, I think there are more people who are like, I'm open, but I don't know. You know, I'm not following this stuff. I have a life. I got 3 kids. You want me to follow this story? Like, no. I think those guys, I think there's more of them than there are people who are like, I will follow Donald Trump to the death.
Right.
And I think that they're available. And so I think that there's going to be, I think here's the good news, is that Trump's base is going to shrink. He has a political record now. And it's already started. I mean, there's an amazing, interesting poll that came out, I think a week ago. I think it was a CNN poll. And it said, do you think Donald Trump is more honest than the average politician? And only 27% said yes. And that is a cutting into his 35% base. I mean, listen, I get that. I mean, I can't imagine how horrible Barack Obama would have had to have been in his first 2 years for me to be like, yeah, screw that guy. That was a horrible vote. You know what I mean? Like, right. I think he did a good job. He's one of my favorite presidents of all time. But I was 2 years in. I wasn't questioning. I was still on board, regardless of what he would have done, frankly. Now, by 3 or 4 years in, I was a supporter of his entire time he's in office. But I was probably 3 years in more open to criticism than I was a year or a year and a half in. So I think that we don't have to give them patience. You don't have to do anything. But I think understanding that the first 2 years of a presidency, he is given a super amount of leeway always, is an important thing to remember. And I think that also another thing to remember is that when Nixon left office, he had 25% approval ratings. And there's this expectation that we have of like, well, Trump has to go to 0. No, he doesn't. If he stays at 35, he's toast. And I think that, obviously we have to be careful, and we don't want to get complacent, and we don't want to just sort of sit on our butts and say we're good. But I think that there is a notion that he's more Teflon than I think he will be. But listen, I didn't think he was going to win the first time, so what do I know?
Right. Yeah, and so what's interesting now is we got these midterm elections getting ready to come up at the time of this recording, and I'm still wondering, like, how much. I mean, obviously they're still interfering with our election now. They're still meddling in our election, and are we going to? I mean, I don't. The problem is that what Putin's doing a good job of is getting this distrust of government, and that's the problem. Is how do we find the actual truth? And I feel like that we need to be better as skeptical people of critically thinking about the information, and how do we try to understand the truth about things and the problem with it. So, go ahead.
No, I completely agree. I think that's, and the problem is I don't know how that doesn't get worse before it gets better. We're gonna have to deal with this. Let's make no mistakes. Honestly, like seriously, getting rid of Trump will be really bad for America. It will be. It would be worse keeping him. It wouldn't be as bad as keeping him in there. But it's going to hurt everybody. It's going to be a negative thing. And we have to be prepared for that. This is going to things are going to get worse before they get better. It's almost inevitable.
That's funny. I say that all the time. It's going to get worse. And eliminating Trump is not going to eliminate the problem. There's still a much bigger problem out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, the thing that sucks the most in a weird way is the worse things are here, the more easy it is for the Russians to take advantage of it.
Right.
Like, they're not wrong in pointing out income inequality. It's just the purpose for which they're doing it is to undermine those people who are not being represented already. And so it's a tough sell where it's like, yeah, the guy who's mentioning, the only person in the room mentioning that I'm not getting a seat at the table is trying to take the table.
Right.
And so it's hard to interact because I don't want to be the guy that's like, oh, no, there isn't an income inequality issue in America. There clearly is.
Right.
It's what do we want to do about it and how do we want to respond to that? So, yeah.
And it is complicating. I mean, that's the one thing that you brought up just a little bit ago. Like, we got busy lives, man, trying to work, trying to take care of, like, trying to manage our lives and trying to condense all this amount of information. And the problem is these are complex issues, and we make everything black and white, and that's what charlatans and con artists do. They'll take advantage of the simplicity of it and just bullshit us and think, oh, well, I'm going to, like, fast food us the information. And we don't have time to always dissect it. But it's still important, especially right now, for us to do that.
And that's the big reason why I wanted to make the film, honestly. Like, I was obsessed with the topic. I knew that it was interesting. I knew that there was a lot of good stuff there. But I also knew, like, listen, if this weren't a thing that obsessed me specifically, I wouldn't read a book about it. I wouldn't sit down and, spend 10 hours reading, going through a book and doing it necessarily. Maybe. But I don't think most people are. And I don't think that should be an expectation that you have to. And so just watching a movie that's 2 hours long, that's entertaining, that moves, that has a sort of flair to it. That for me, that was what the biggest reason I wanted to do it, was to give people who wouldn't understand what happened here that information in a way that's entertaining as well. That's that they don't feel like they're having to do homework for 2 hours.
Right. And you really did an amazing job at it. People, like, seriously, watch the film. It'll really break down even if you're not aware of the whole entire bigger picture, it's painted out in such a great way for you to really truly understand it. And I've watched other documentaries like on this from, like Al Jazeera, BBC, and this is literally one of the best ones I've actually seen really put it together. And it's amazing because we still don't know what the outcome is going to be of this. So we live in an interesting time. Are you thinking about doing anything to follow up with it, or like once you get more information?
I think that it's possible. I mean, we were talking about doing this as a mini-series initially because we did 30 interviews. We've got 30 hours of interviews still and a lot of really great stuff that we weren't able to use. And I think that there is certainly this opportunity for follow-up. I think that there's an opportunity to maybe expand it into a mini-series. We wanted to do this first one first. People could just sit down, watch it one sitting, get the whole thing.
Sure.
But I think that definitely, also depends what happens in midterms.
Yeah.
I'm very nervous about Russian activity in midterms. I think without that, the Dems have 100%, not 100%, but a very, very high chance of taking the House and very likely the Senate too, I think. But I think if we find ourselves, if they do it and we catch them even, what do we do then? What's the next step? What if the Republicans say, nah, I don't know. I don't know where the country goes then. I think that's probably the thing that scares me the most.
Right.
Because that's a constitutional crisis without a resolution that is undermining our country, without a resolution that wouldn't undermine our country in very strong, severe ways.
No doubt. I got a couple of questions. In fact, if you guys got we're getting ready to wrap up here, but if you guys have some questions, I know I see some people here in the chat talking, whatever. But if you got some questions, we'll try to answer them here briefly, real quick. I got a question from a guy named Matt George. He says, why are the Republicans complicit in the invidious Russian campaign against democracy? We kind of went over that again, but maybe he came in a little bit late. Maybe you can just briefly answer that question.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the best case scenario and worst case scenario in my mind. Best case scenario is that it's a cynical ploy to keep power because they see their supporters as supporting Donald Trump. The Republican Party has shrunk significantly over the last few years. So the actual people voting in primaries are the extreme right of the right. And they need to appeal to those people to win their jobs. Best case scenario. Worst case scenario is this has been a slow creep for a very long time. I think that's absolutely the case. I don't know how much of it plays, though. Jack Abramoff was dealing with the Russians with Tom DeLay back in about 2006. So this has been going on for a while. I hope it is not because they are so entrenched and we're just starting to notice it. I hope it is a cynical political ploy. It could be a combination of both.
You know, I hate speculation, but and we're going to wait for the facts of the Mueller investigation to come out. But what are some of your thoughts? Where do you see this actually going? This is only what we know. Obviously, there's probably a lot that we don't know. But what do you see is, everybody says, there's smoke, smoke, smoke. What do you think is the fire that's going to be the thing that brings it together?
Well, I think the Monica Lewinsky dress ruined it for everything in a weird way. That the expectation that there is one piece of evidence that is going to make the case is never how things go. Almost never. Most cases that are brought and convicted on, as we saw with the Manafort case, it is a mass amounts of evidence which all points in one direction. And so I think that already exists. And I think that what you're going to see, nobody knows, obviously. All knowledge is the best approximation, right? So we're just guessing what's going to happen. But I think that you are going to, it's very hard for me to imagine a scenario where you don't see Trump picked to death before Mueller even does anything, really. I mean, maybe that wasn't the case, but he's going to get picked to death. It's going to be the New York State Attorney General going after the foundation. It's going to be the Eastern District of Virginia. It's going to be the New York Southern District. There might be a Florida charges. There might be Texas charges. There might be others. And so I think it's going to be coming at him from all sides over in the next year. I think he's out of office this time next year. That's best guess. Obviously, I don't know. But the moves that are being made, I don't think Mueller spreads the investigation out like this unless that's what he's doing. But I'll also say this. I have zero sources in the Mueller investigation. I don't know anybody that knows anything that's going on within that investigation that is based on people I've talked to that know Mueller and have worked with him in the past, and based on people who are just seeing what he's doing in public. But that is not based on special knowledge of what's going on inside the investigation.
Interesting. So, ladies and gentlemen, the documentary is Active Measures. It really is a phenomenal documentary. There's so much more than even what we're talking about here. And you guys already know some of the stuff on the news. Most comprehensive documentary that I've seen. Where can I send people to go see this? I know I saw this online, but where can I send most of the people if they want to check it out?
iTunes and Amazon is playing it right now. It's Fandango now, but iTunes is the one we try to push the most, basically.
Okay, cool. And do you have a website if anybody wants any more information?
Yeah, sorry, it's activemeasures.com, and then our Twitter feed is @actmeasuresdoc.
Okay, sounds good. Jack, thank you so much for being here today. I really do appreciate it. Again, thank you for being out there and fighting the really good fight. I know how hard it is, especially as a filmmaker, to get the word out there, to get the truth out there. But I'm glad that there's people like you out there, because we got to fight people like Dinesh D'Souza out there too. So we got to make sure we get the facts to people. But again, this isn't just a partisan issue. This is about defending the truth. This is bigger than Republican and Democrat. And I really hope that you guys really take the time to really explore this film. And please tell people about this film. It's a phenomenal film. So Jack, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. And yeah, you're absolutely right. This is about corruption, not politics. But thanks. Thank you so much.
You got it. Anyways, that's our show for today, guys. If this is your first time on the broadcast, please make sure you hit that like button, hit subscribe, and we'll be back next week. Peace out.